Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. Recently, our Bible study has been diving into and studying the book of Job, and obviously one of the core focuses of Job is on suffering, right? I think it mirrors a lot of things that are later discussed in the New Testament, where we're told that we will suffer and that this is kind of part of this life, right?
Well, it's interesting because the whole book is pretty explicitly addressing the very common and age-old question of why do bad things happen to people we are perceiving as good? Why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
It's like a lot of people have that objection or that confusion, that question, and fair enough, right? It's something that probably everyone has wrestled with at some point in their life.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because Job very explicitly addresses that exact issue, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think oftentimes people will bring that up as an objection to God or Christianity or what have you. And I oftentimes think to myself, are you really so narcissistic that you think you're the first person to have thought about this? Do you really think that everyone who believes in God or everyone who is a Christian is so naive that this has never crossed their mind, that they've never suffered in any capacity?
Or considered how people could suffer so greatly, why that happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I mean, to be fair, like, it's a tricky thing to wrestle with, right? I get it, because I think everyone wrestles with that at some point. I think it's one of those things where there's not necessarily, like, a clear answer that is going to be universally satisfactory. Like, there is an answer, but I think it's just about kind of on a personal level, each individual person coming to an understanding of that and a personal conviction for why that can happen and why the world is that way sometimes. Like, it's not something that can be demonstrated obviously to everyone in a clear-cut argument. It's kind of a more, like, I don't know if this makes sense what I'm trying to say, but subjective personal conviction about how your soul comes to terms and acceptance of why that happens.
I understand what you're saying, and I think people come to an understanding in different ways. And as one of our engineering professors used to always say, all roads lead to Rome, right? And I think
that's not from that professor. That's like a phrase, you know?
Well, that's
he
a
didn't
phrase,
come up with that.
Yeah, she would say that all the time.
Oh, she? I don't know who you're referring to, but okay.
But I think that Rome, in this case, what all of these things point back to is kind of what's described in Job, which is when God says, essentially, am I not God? Did I not make all of this?
The answer is God is sovereign, which that's not a satisfactory answer for everyone, and I understand why. That's why I'm saying it's like, I think it's kind of a personal journey that people have to go through to come to understand that. And once you do, like, for me, I don't really wrestle with that anymore because it's just like my soul has kind of come to peace with it, I guess, and come to understand deeply that I don't know what's best.
Yeah, and I think that that reminds me of a bit of what C.S. Lewis talks about in Letters to Malcolm. He talks about this in kind of the end of chapter 5, and he's talking about, like, going through the Lord's Prayer. And one of the things, one of the phrases in the Lord's Prayer is, lead us not into temptation. And he's kind of talking about what that means to people. And he describes the understanding that a lot of people have as a, quote, friend-like conception of God. So at the end of chapter 5, he says, I was never worried myself by the words, lead us not into temptation, but a great many of my correspondents are. The words suggest to them what someone has called a friend-like conception of God, as one who first forbids us certain fruits and then lures us to taste them. But the Greek word means trial trying circumstances of every sort, a far larger word than English temptation. So that the petition essentially is, make straight our paths, spare us wherever possible from all crises, whether of temptation or affliction. By the way, you yourself, though you've doubtless forgotten it, gave me an excellent gloss on it years ago at a pub in Cotton. You said it added a sort of reservation to all of our preceding prayers, as if we said, in my ignorance I have asked for A, B, and C, but don't give me them if you foresee that they would in reality be to me either snares or sorrows. And you quoted, okay, that's a lot of Latin. And you quoted saying, enormous prayers which heaven in vengeance grants, for we make plenty of such prayers. If God has granted all the silly prayers I've made in my life, where should I be now?
Yeah, I think I've talked about this on Twitter a little bit before, but I kind of resonate with that because I have generally kind of a hard time asking God for things specifically in prayer.
Sure, like a specific outcome.
Yeah, like saying, hey, help me get this job. Help this thing to happen. Help that thing to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just me. I mean, maybe it's not just me based on listening to that, but I find myself, if I'm asking for something like that, it's like this urge within me rises up that I need to qualify and be like, if that's your will, God, like, you know, if it's not, that's fine. Like, that's fine, and help me
like
come
a
to
personal
terms with
check
it.
Almost.
Yeah, but like, it's like it doesn't taste right on my tongue to just say, God, please help this thing happen, and then be done with the prayer. It's like I'm left feeling like there's something out that's unsaid. It's not satisfying to pray like that for me.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I agree. It's like maybe I want that job, maybe I don't. Enough things have happened in my life where they haven't gone the way I wanted at first, or the way that I maybe prayed for. But then in the end, maybe shortly down the road, maybe a long ways down the road, I realized that was the best thing to happen. And enough of those things have happened that for me, in my soul, when I'm praying for things that I want, I always feel like I have to kind of humbly acknowledge, like, if that's your will, like, ultimately I want your will for my life. And what I want most is to be able to accept whatever comes my way and to be able to draw closer to you throughout whatever that is. And so my prayers tend to go more in that direction, and I really have a hard time just asking God for something plain and simple.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the qualifier is like for something to happen, or for like some specific maybe worldly outcome, right? Because you could say, I'm going to pray for wisdom, or help me,
give me peace,
continue to become closer to you, or what have you. Yeah, I think for me too, I've encountered, like you said, so many things where I thought, oh, this thing would be great, this thing would be best, and then I've ended up with something else, right, that wasn't necessarily like my first choice. And then I learn, I don't know, sometimes years later, the outcome of someone who like ended up with my quote unquote first choice, and it was like, oh yeah, that didn't go well at all.
Well, like it was saying at the end of that chapter, it's like I don't even want to think about what my life would be like if some of those stupid bad things that I maybe once wanted actually happened, you know.
Well, I liked the phrase enormous prayers which heaven in vengeance grants. I don't know, I think that phrase kind of reminds me of the other thing that C.S. Lewis talks about. Like, what's the quote? It's something to the effect of there are two people, those to whom
there are two people
God,
in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done.
Yeah.
You have a hard time quoting that one.
I get it all.
I feel like end. Every time
I get it in the end.
You try to quote that one a lot, and I feel
Slowly.
Like every time it's like 5 seconds, just loading, buffer.
Well, I want to make sure I get it right. When I think about a quote, I a lot of people will start it out, and then they'll try and figure it out along the way. I try and get the whole thing, and then...
Yeah, it's just I feel like I'm watching live action buffering.
Thanks. Appreciate it, hon. But yeah, this section of Letters to Malcolm, and then also in a study of Job, it just got me kind of thinking a lot about like suffering. And for me, I started asking the question, why does it feel like I have had comparatively little hardship in comparison to other people? I'm not saying, oh, I've never suffered, or like life is just so perfect. I've had hardship, but it feels like when I look at other people and other situations, it feels like I haven't had to go through all that much. And
Well, there's a variety of reasons for that.
yeah,
Like for you personally.
but
Or
I'm
me
speaking
personally.
on yeah, I'm speaking on like more religious level, let's say. A more theological level. Like why did that occur?
Yeah, but I'm saying like there are 15 layers to this. There's one aspect where it's like, well, you were blessed with fortunate circumstances such that you had a two-parent household and financially secure household growing up. Like that's outside of your control and greatly contributed to your quality of life. But
Yeah.
then there's also things like, well, you've made good decisions in your life. So some people suffer because they've kind of brought it upon themselves with their decisions, and you've been conscientious enough to avoid that kind of suffering.
Yeah, so it's that latter portion, because from an engineering perspective, I try and really like conscientiously think things through, solve problems, right, optimize things. It just kind of comes with the territory, right? And I got thinking, like, why exactly is it that I feel, at least, like I suffer less? I got thinking, as I usually do, on like a very practical level first. And you had talked about someone who you watch on YouTube, and you were kind of chuckling at some of the things because you would describe how, like, a glass jar, let's say, would fall.
Oh, you're talking about Becky.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this YouTuber I watch, she's super sweet. She does like home cooking and gardening videos and stuff. But yeah, she's a little clumsy, I guess I could say, and it's kind
Sure.
of funny because I'm watching her videos sometimes and I'm looking at things like that's precarious, that's gonna fall, that's gonna break. The way
Like
you're
you're
doing this is,
anticipating it, yeah.
I know this is gonna happen, and then guess what? 2 minutes later, the box of mason jars drops
Yeah.
and breaks, and it's like, yeah, I saw that was gonna happen, and she's kind of playing it off in her video, this like, oh, look at what's happening to me today, like all these, and it's like,
Sure.
I know it's lighthearted. I'm not really bashing her here. I'm just saying it's this thing of like, well, how many times do the mason jars have to fall off before it's something you're doing, not something that's being done to you?
Well, yeah, and I think you can kind of expand that to a greater level. Like, oh, all these bad things are happening to me. And you kind of ask the question, like, well, how many of them are you doing to yourself, though?
Right.
How many of these are you, like, directly contributing to in some way? And I'm not saying that, oh, if you suffer in any capacity, like, that's
Oh.
on you. I'm not saying
Right,
that at
right.
all. But
It's not 100% of the instances, right? Obviously,
No.
people go through suffering that's completely outside of their control, has nothing to do with any decision they've made.
yeah, but there is suffering that people go through
There is
wholly
self-inflicted
in their
suffering
control.
for sure. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And, this person who you watch reminds me a lot of my sister, actually. Where throughout life, she went through, I would say, comparatively greater hardship than I did. But my sister and I are very different than each other. And, I think one of those main differences was exemplified when somebody asked my dad recently, like, how he would describe me. How would you describe your son? And he said, one of the things characteristic about my son is if there is a best way of doing something and he knows it, he will do that thing. So if you get the owner's manual for something and it says you should change the oil every X many miles, he's going to do exactly that. And I think that's something that my sister doesn't do as much, which then I think begs the question, how many of those pieces of hardship could have been prevented if you did everything that you could, let's say. Let's take the mason jar example, where somebody's breaking mason jars and you ask the question, how many times do you have to break mason jars before you go, oh, maybe I'm contributing to this. Maybe it's me, not the world against me, basically. And I think that question might be part of the answer to why is it that I feel like I don't suffer as much. Because I think you can almost extrapolate out a rule that says something like, you will suffer until you learn the lesson, right? And sometimes the lesson is like very obvious and straightforward and practical, like don't put mason jars on the side of the table, right along the edge. But I think maybe with other things too, we suffer because we have not learned some larger lesson in general, right? Something that is maybe less practical, more on like a theological or moral front.
Do you mean in the sense that like God allows or perhaps even inflicts suffering such that someone can learn a specific lesson, and if it takes you a long time to learn it, he will just keep allowing that suffering? Or are you saying more like conceptually where you're going to feel like you're suffering until you've learned how to manage that and then not suffer so much?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. So on one hand, you could say, like with the feeling side of things, right? I don't think substantially fewer things break around me. Or I don't think fewer random catastrophes occur around me than anyone else. But when a catastrophe comes up, I do think that I am more well prepared than the average. Like Dave Ramsey kind of talks about this when he says, when you're more wealthy, when you're more well off financially, when you're managing your money well, things that were emergencies before are no longer emergencies. So for instance, I don't know, a few months back, you needed to go on a work trip and I was going to drive you to the airport. I backed the car out of the garage and one of the tires was basically completely flat, like sitting on the rim.
Yeah.
And we had to call up your mom and she had to take you to the airport because the tire was completely flat.
And I had to be at the airport like now.
Yeah. And
thankfully she was available to drive me to the airport.
Yeah, this was a big blessing. But a lot of people would, like, this would be a big thing. Like, oh, shoot, the tire, I can't drive on the car. I'm going to have to buy a new tire. I ended up
the whole
going...
world is falling apart. Everything's bad.
Yeah.
I'm so stressed out.
Yeah. And I ended up having to go through, like, the whole rigmarole to get a new tire and get it mounted and get the car to the tire shop and all this stuff. And, like, yeah, it was annoying and it was a hassle. But at the end of the day, like, I got it turned around in a couple of days. It wasn't all that bad. And, yeah, okay, it cost a couple $100, but, like, that's just kind of life. But now imagine if instead of having a fund for, like, car repairs that we, slowly contribute to, if we were living paycheck to paycheck and didn't have anything like that. Well, now $200 is this big blow-up thing.
Yes.
So from that standpoint, I feel like, yeah, to a degree, it's like how you feel or how it personally affects you. But I also think you use two phrasings. Does God inflict suffering or does God allow something to happen? I think the allow is more correct phrasing because it's more about just like the nature of how things go, and allow is a much more apt word for that.
Right, but I don't know that fully answers the question of why certain things that are completely outside of our control happen per se. Like that doesn't really answer why my friend's baby died 5 days after being born. It doesn't answer that.
And I'm not saying that like this is some wholly...
Because I don't think the reason why things like that happen is because, oh, you need to learn a lesson out of this. This is why God allowed this to happen. Now, I don't think that means there's not something good that can still come out of it. that we can look for and hope for, or maybe certain lessons that you can come out of those with. But I don't know that the primary answer for why those things happen, is so that you can learn a lesson.
Well, yeah, I'm not saying this is the only reason. I'm saying this is a reason that some things happen.
I know. I'm just saying I think that's probably a qualifier. Like, I don't...
Yes, that's a good qualifier.
There's different kinds of suffering, right? There's, like we talked about, there's suffering that's clearly self-inflicted. There's suffering that's maybe not as clearly self-inflicted, but is self-preventable. Like, you have the power to prevent. And then there are those things where it's like you literally have no control over that. And nobody has an answer for why that happened to you, but we believe that good can still come out of it. And more on that, the first side of it, where these are things that are clearly self-inflicted, or maybe slightly less clearly self-inflicted, but still self-avoidable, like you have power to avoid it. I think that's probably more the realm you're talking about here.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about with that, I think you touched on it a little bit, and I mentioned this in our small group when we've been going through Job, but suffering is, to a degree, subjective. Like, two people can be going through the exact same circumstances, and one person could be suffering way more than the other. You know, like...
Yeah.
Because different people handle things differently, or... You know, I obviously believe that if you have a solid faith community and foundation of faith, belief in God, these kinds of things, I think that can make going through suffering so much easier than it can be otherwise. So even if you and someone else are going through the exact same thing, but one person has this solid foundation and hope and faith, they can be suffering way less through the exact same thing. So in that way, it is almost like this subjective experience in terms of the level of suffering you experience. And so even in that way, you have, I guess, a power to control maybe the level of your suffering. I don't know. Maybe that sounds bad because I'm not going to pretend like I understand all these horrible, horrible things people can go through. But I think there is this level where it's kind of subjective. How much you're going to suffer for the same thing might be different than someone else.
Yeah. I mean, here's maybe an extreme example where you see that. So, suffering, I think good things can come out of suffering, right? We can agree on that.
Yes.
Okay. So, just because there's suffering does not mean that the thing that comes out of it is bad, right?
Or that everything that comes out of it is bad.
Yeah. And one way that people suffer is to have, let's say, their plans radically shifted or upended. Okay. Right? Like when you have plans for something and then things radically change, you almost have to mourn the death of those previous plans, of those previous dreams and visions and hopes, right? That has to die, and that's part of the suffering, right? I want you to keep that in mind for the example that I'm about to bring up. So when I was young, we had some two sets of friends, and both couples ended up having a kid with pretty severe autism, right? To where they're going to affect them for the whole of their lives. They're not going to, be able to integrate into society in like the traditional fashion. Okay. And with one couple, the two people ended up getting divorced. It put a serious strain on their marriage and they ended up breaking up. Okay. It's a very difficult thing for anyone to go through. And they weren't able to do that. Okay. And the other couple was able to come together through that and strengthen their family even more. Okay? And I want to be very clear. Both of these children are immense blessings. And I'm not meaning to say that like this is some serious negative. I'm just saying that this is a radical change to someone's life, and any radical change like that comes with some level of suffering. And the drastic response difference between those two, I think, really well illustrates how two different parties can respond in completely polar opposite ways to something. Things can pull people together or pull them apart. I guess I just think, like, in things like that, whether it's something that is caused by some action that you're taking, right, like the mason jar on the side of the table, I think that in any time that we're suffering, we ought to be asking the question, what is it that I should learn from this? Because any time that God allows us to suffer, I do believe that there's something that we can learn from that. I think it's almost implicit in the statement that we're suffering. Just like the fact that I am alive says to me that God wants me to do something. Because if there wasn't something that he wanted me to do, then I would be dead. My time on this earth would be, like, I would have fulfilled that purpose. If there's something else for me to do, I'm still going to be here. If there's nothing, then I'm going to be taken away. Right? And I think similarly, if we're suffering, there's something that we could be learning from it.
Yeah, I do think that's the proper way to look at it whenever you find yourself in a situation like that, right? Whether or not it's something that you can or ever will understand why it happens, even if it's something that's outside of your control. I think you can enter it with a mentality of how can I use this to grow in some way, to become a better person, or to just learn something out of it. Even if that learning is just forming a deeper personal conviction about, why these things are allowed to happen, or conviction about the importance of grounding yourself in faith in Christ, or whatever you're taking out of it. The book of James talks about this. It literally says, consider it joy when you face trials of any kind. Like that is a hard lesson. That is hard to go into something that's causing you grief and pain and suffering, and to try to find joy in that. That is hard. That's something we all need to struggle with.
Well, I think there's a good distinction that I think should be made there, which is, I think a lot of times people ask the question, like, why is this happening? Right? Why did this thing happen? And I think I want to be clear that when we say, oh, you should learn something from this, it's not meant to be an answer to the why necessarily. So for instance, like, we recently had our microwave break.
It's a very mild example of suffering.
Sure. Yeah, it's super mild, but I think it can be extrapolated up too. So the microwave broke. We did some diagnosis, and I ended up replacing the magnetron. Yeah,
which sounds like a transformer.
Yeah, I ended up replacing the magnetron, which sounds like a fake thing.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's made up in some sci-fi film. But we ended up replacing that, okay? I learned more about microwaves than I did before, but that doesn't answer the question, like, why did the microwave break? I still don't know why the magnetron gave up, died. I don't know what was broken with it even. I know that replacing it fixed it, but that doesn't answer the question, why did the microwave break? I don't know the cause for it.
Yeah.
But I was able to walk away with with a better understanding of microwaves, with more information under my belt on how to fix things in the future, having worked with my father-in-law, like deepening that relationship. So the answer to the question, what can I learn from this, is not the same as the answer to the question, why did this thing happen?
Right. That's kind of how I see what the story of Job is about too, and the conclusion that Job comes to at the end. Because at the end, he doesn't get a reason for why these things happen to him.
Yeah. Correct.
He doesn't.
Correct. Yeah.
But he comes to a deeper understanding and appreciation for the sovereignty of God.
He learned the lesson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. He does not get an answer for why these things happen. He comes out and is able to grow through them, but he doesn't get an answer. And I think all of us will go through something like that, where we don't understand why something happened, and you probably won't understand this side of heaven why that happens. But that doesn't mean that it was pointless. That doesn't mean that it can't be turned to something good or used for something good.
Yeah. I understand that this is, like, if you would be in an instance of suffering, I'm not saying that this is like some comforting thing, but I do think that it's something to consider when, like, maybe you're not in that, and prepare for it mentally first. But I almost feel like asking the question, why did this happen, is inherently a backwards looking question, whereas asking the question, what can I or do I need to learn from this, is an inherently forward looking question. And, like, we can't go back and change whatever, but we can change things going forward. And for that reason, I think it's inherently a more productive question to be asking. What can I learn from this? What do I need to change going forward? Than, why am I suffering in this way? Why did this thing happen to me?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think perhaps we should be trying to pray something more like, God, help me to learn and submit to you. Help me to see clearly that which I need to learn, and help me to see the things that I can't right now that affect me. I think praying something like that, like we kind of talked about at the beginning, allows for us to submit to God's will, not to pigeonhole ourselves into wanting one thing in particular, and to acknowledge God's sovereignty, and is, like we were talking about, inherently more forward looking.
Yeah. I don't think it's wrong to pray for specific things. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong to go to God with your requests, your prayers, and petitions. But I do think that no matter what it is you're praying for, the first thing that you should be desiring is deeper communion with Him,
Mm-hmm.
and wisdom and understanding. Because
Mm-hmm.
if your number one priority in praying with God is to get the specific outcome you want, I think you're missing the point of prayer.
Yeah, I feel like the point of prayer is more for us to
It's
reorient ourselves to orient ourselves toward God and to grow in relationship with Him.
it's to allow ourselves to be drawn closer to Him.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at prayer as a means to an end, and the end being some worldly outcome to something that you're looking for, I really think you're missing the bigger picture, and missing out on maybe something better and deeper that God wants for you.
Yeah. You know, when we're at church, we help out in, like, the little kids' room. And when we're talking about the message with the kids, at the end of it, we always close with prayer, obviously. And, you know, the kids are young, right? They're, like, under the age of 5, basically. And
These are preschoolers.
yeah. So I try and explain things in very basic terms, obviously. And one of my go-to is when we're talking about praying, I try and remind the kids. I say prayer is really just us talking with God. We can do that whenever and wherever. Right? And I think boiling things down to that, like, almost childish, most fundamental basic terms, you know, I think that's probably a pretty good comparison, because if you think, let's say you went to a friend, and every single time you went to the friend, all you were doing was asking them for something, right? That friendship, that relationship isn't going to be super great. It's not going to be a real strong one, right? That person's like going to feel used. You're not actually growing in a relationship with them. You don't really care about how they feel, what they want here. And I feel like we should maybe try and see our relationship with God and that prayer more in that way. Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently, I've encountered a few kind of more niche items that I've been trying to acquire, things that maybe have been discontinued by a manufacturer, or I've just not been able to find at a typical retail store or even online. And they got me thinking about, how one would go about finding some of these items. I almost feel like there should be a service that's like the reverse of eBay. So eBay, people list a bunch of different items that they have, and then you can buy them. But this would be where people post things that they want with kind of like a bounty of sorts, and then other people can go searching for those things. So you're kind of outsourcing how one could find a super niche item. It'd probably be a little bit more complicated process, but I think that many of the people that would try and source these things would have a lot of fun doing it. I mean, there are people online that like to try and comb over like old police files to figure things out, and they like doing that kind of sleuthing thing. I think that could kind of be a win-win, right? People could get their fix on sleuthing things out and having fun sourcing stuff, and then on the other side, those that are looking for a super niche item might be able to find it on a website where that's really the only place to. But that's just what I've been musing about recently. If you have any thoughts on suffering, or maybe even the website already exists, maybe I'm not aware of it yet, feel free to shoot us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. With that, thank you again for listening, and have a good night.